Thank you for being part of the Let My People Go webinar. Each month, we're talking about how the local church and how Christians can engage things like human trafficking, how we can actually fight this global injustice by loving those who are most vulnerable to it. And today, I'm really excited to be joined by a good friend of mine, Tchividijian, who was actually featured in my book, Vulnerable. And so if you're reading the book and you've read that chapter, you're in for a treat tonight because you're actually going to meet the man, the myth, and the legend. So, Boz, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's all myth and no legend, let me tell you.
Yeah, it's maybe.
I'm glad to be here.
Well, Boz, could you tell us a little bit about your organization, Grace?
Sure. When I was a prosecutor many years ago, I learned really firsthand by the number of cases that I prosecuted that involved sexual abuse, to the point where I helped start a division that just focused on those types of cases. And long and the short of it, Raleigh, is I noticed in those cases, so many of them involved the church in some capacity. And more often than not, when the church was involved, there was just a failed response, either a failure to protect the vulnerable or a failure to respond to the vulnerable. And so in 2004, I came together with a group of other individuals from various disciplines who all realized that the church needed to step up to the plate and to be the church when it comes to protecting the vulnerable and loving them well, and not protecting those who are hurting them. And we started Grace. We started Grace in 2004, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. And our purpose is really to train and equip the church to really transform itself into the safest, most affirming communities for those who've been wounded, and the least safe for those who do the wounding. So that's Grace in a nutshell.
So as we talk about abuse in churches, could you give us an example of what that could look like? And
Wow.
Like when those in power kind of try to cover that up.
Yeah, I mean, abuse occurs. One of the common threads of abuse is the imbalance and exploitation of power. So there are all types of abuse that go on in church cultures. So you can have spiritual abuse, you can have physical abuse, you certainly have sexual abuse, emotional abuse. So an example could be anywhere from the lead pastor who will use his position of authority to browbeat and verbally abuse and demean somebody, and be held to zero accountability for it, and actually maybe be even affirmed in his behavior because he is the pastor. He is God's representative in that church. He is the well-beloved leader of that church. And so the wounded person has no voice. The wounded person ends up oftentimes either remaining silent or walking out the door. And so you do that. That's one end of the spectrum, which is serious. And then, you go all the way up to situations of physical or even sexual abuse, where we've seen it today in the news in the last few weeks, even more and more situations involving church leaders exploiting their power to sexually abuse both children and adults. And those dynamics are very similar in the way that they gravitate towards the most vulnerable who have very little voice, and they will deceive, confuse, and manipulate those individuals, especially the adult victims, into a position where they're being abused. And there's oftentimes no accountability, because somebody who's being, for example, an adult who's being sexually abused by a leader is going to be told by that leader and be shamed into silence by that leader, because that leader is going to say, you're just as fault as I am. And so do you really want the public, do you really want the church community to know that you're actually more at fault than me because you pursued me, you seduced me, And even if there's no truth to that at all, the reality is that vulnerable person ends up oftentimes being shamed into silence because they buy that lie. So that's again, that's just another example. We could go on, sadly.
So we know that this is a reality in our churches. So how do we recognize this in our churches? How do we recognize abuse when it's actually happening?
Well, I would say first, I'm not so sure. You and I may know it's a reality in our churches. I think, quite frankly, in most churches, they don't think it's a reality. So you might have a church that goes, "Hey, we're really vigilant in protecting our kids from offenders, sexual offenders, and we're really going to be, we've got policies and procedures, and we're really vigilant on those things." All the while, their leadership is spiritually abusing, emotionally abusing, or maybe even sexually abusing other adults. So we have to come to the realization and understanding of what the imbalance of power is and what it does. And I think that how we recognize it is the fact that we acknowledge that there are people in our churches who have power, whether it's the pastor, whether it's the church staff, or whether it's the wealthy donor. They have power. And what do we do to discourage the use of that power in ways that that wound other people? How do we identify it? And are there mechanisms within that church culture that empower people, empower the weak, empower the vulnerable to step forward, to hold those with power accountable, in check? And I don't know. I'm not so convinced as I sit here today that there is such a way to do that, and that's discouraging to me.
And so you mentioned earlier that we're seeing this in the headlines over and over and over. There's the abuse of power, and oftentimes this abuse of power always kind of intersects with vulnerability. And so someone who is vulnerable is often exploited by someone with more power. And we even see that in the safe places like the church, that places where we think, wow, nothing really bad can happen here. And as you know, part of my story, some of the churches that I've been in throughout my life, I've experienced that, where it was supposed to be a safe place and it just wasn't. And people were hurt and wounded in very significant ways. And so as we kind of talk about this, I have a lot of questions, but I guess one would be, how should a Christian community, how should a church interact and include victims and survivors of abuse? How do we even get there if we're not oftentimes noticing it? How do we get to that point?
Right. Well, a couple quick things. One, going back to what you said earlier, I think oftentimes those in power that exploit it and wound other people are, when you scratch below the surface, are pretty vulnerable people themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But they have learned how to hide that vulnerability by grabbing power and by morphing into narcissists that protect that power. So I think that's just something we have to recognize, that yes, you have powerful people who are preying on vulnerable people, but oftentimes the most powerful people ultimately below the surface are the most vulnerable. They've learned how to hide it and how to deflect it and how to act on it in ways that again protects them from in their own mind, protects them from getting hurt. I think the other, to answer your question, I think one of the things what we've learned in the Me Too movement in the last couple of years is, and somebody asked me this recently, what has been the impact in the church? And I said, one of the impacts, and I think has been in the church, it's been a positive, is that it has personalized this offense. If we're just talking, especially if we're talking about sexual abuse, people are reading on their Facebook posts, on Facebook feeds, and on their Twitter feeds, Me Too stories of family members, of friends, of coworkers that they never knew were survivors of abuse. And so now suddenly that person who's reading that story online, the issue has become deeply personal because it involves somebody they deeply love and admire and respect. And I think that that's a step in the right direction when we recognize the fact that this issue, abuse, has affected everyone, everyone. And when we personalize and realize that, wow, these everyone's are all around us. So what do we do in our church communities to even help create safe spaces for those everyone's to talk about it? And how do we learn from them? I mean, we need to be learning from each other. Not only do we need to be grieving for the abuse our friends and our families and our coworkers have suffered from, and especially those inside the church, but we need to be learning from them. We need to be sitting down and listening and learning, giving them a seat at the table. And I find that one of the challenges in a lot of churches today is that a lot of, especially in the evangelical world, the leadership of these churches is exclusively one gender. And yes, there are male survivors of abuse, and we need to be listening to them and learning from them. But there are also a lot of females who have suffered from horrific types of abuse, sexual, emotional, spiritual, and we need to give them a seat at the table. We need to be listening to them. We need to be elevating their value in our churches, not just as the women of the church, but as sisters, as co-laborers together in the church. And so, I'm not here to preach against certain polities of churches. That's not my objective here. My objective is to say, you know what? If you have a session in your Presbyterian church, when's the last time you invited women to come sit in on your session meetings? When's the last time you asked them? They may not be able to vote, but when's the last time you asked them for their advice and their counsel, other than session members sitting around going, I'll talk to my wife about that. We have to go deep. We have to dig deep into the heart and soul of the church today before we begin to understand and begin to really take steps dealing with this issue of the imbalance of power. Because when you start out on it, when you talk about just in general evangelical churches, the imbalance of power often starts at the gender. And if we don't get that, if we don't grasp that, if the male leaders of these churches don't recognize that, it'll never change. And so they have to be willing to not only recognize it, but do something about it. And not just do something to placate the females and make them happy. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying to go, wow, we have not listened to and learned from a whole gender within our church that could teach us much. What do we need to do to change that? Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent, but that's a little bit of what I'm, I think you have to address those fundamental issues, cultural issues, before we start talking about some of the other things that are really important, but aren't really going to change if we don't deal with those fundamentals first.
No, and I think that's a very good point, because at the end of the day, many of us, when we're reading the headlines, we're horrified and we're scared and we're like, no, this can't be happening, and it should not be happening in churches, and it can't happen in my church. We don't want it to happen in our churches. But oftentimes there are cultural issues that we've just never thought about that exploiters can hide in the shadows of. They know how to fit the culture of the church, and they know how to exploit vulnerable people within the church. And so I really liked what you were saying about listening to people who are vulnerable, listening to people who've experienced abuse. What would that look like for a pastor? Like, say a pastor, he's going to his church, preaching 2-3 times a week. What could that look like for a pastor who maybe he has never done that? How would they go and connect with people who have experienced that in their church to learn more?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are lots of different ways to do it. I think the pastor probably should take some time learning and reading and not just taking a step back and saying, I want to take a little bit of time to not become an expert on this issue, but but just to be teachable and just get some general framework for these issues. There's plenty of really good resources out there for that. I think the other thing is to begin talking about it. I have a really good friend of mine who is a pastor of a church up in outside of Philadelphia, and a Presbyterian church. And she's a survivor of abuse. And she came to a church. It was her very first church, her pastorate. And a year earlier, a man in the church had been arrested for sexually abusing a minor inside one of the Sunday school classrooms. He had been arrested. He had left the church. I think the case was pending trial. And she said, Boz, it's weird. I'm at this church, and it's 85 people, small church, elderly congregation. She goes, and nobody's talking about this. Nobody's talking about this horrific thing that happened on our church campus. And there's something wrong with that. I've got to change that. And so she made a decision early on to do an 8-week sermon series on abuse. Now, this is within the first month or two of her arriving at this church. So it's a pretty bold move. And she did an 8-week sermon series unpacking what scripture has to say about abuse. She called me after that and said, I need to tell you something. She goes, we have 85 people in our church. Since I've preached that sermon series, I've had 25 women from the ages of 55 to 85 come to me and disclose to me that they are survivors of sexual abuse as a child or sexual assault as an adult. She goes, half of those women, I'm the very first person that they ever told. And I said, that's tragic that so many people in a church, it's the realization of how prevalent that offense is. But I said, you created a safe space. Do you imagine being an 85-year-old woman who's probably been in church her entire life, and it wasn't until her pastor stood up and started speaking about it and naming it and creating that safe space that she felt safe enough to come out of the shadows and talk about the most horrific, traumatic aspect of her entire life. So that opened up conversations. Talk about opening up conversations. People beginning to step forward because, wow, the pastor has helped create a safer space by talking about it. And by talking about it not as an expert and a know-it-all, but by somebody who is desiring for their church body to learn and understand what abuse is and how it goes against the very character of who God is. And if we can't create a community of believers that are open and willing and welcoming those types of conversations with the hurting and the wounded, then we shouldn't be calling ourselves a church. And so I see that as in answering your question as a beautiful example of something somebody can do. They took a risk. So I guess you back it up and go, you first recognize the problem. I think there are a lot of pastors, Raleigh, that would have gotten to that church, who would have learned about that history of that individual being arrested and nobody talking about it, and wouldn't even noticed or have been bothered by the fact that nobody was talking about it. She noticed that. So you have to notice, but then you have to do something about it. And doing something about it is risky. She could have easily been run out of that church in the first 2 weeks, but she took the risk. She was bold to step forward. And because she was bold and took that step forward, she enabled others to do the same thing. She empowered others to do the same thing. And I think that that's just, again, one example of many that I think practical example pastors can do. But, in order to do that, you got to recognize it and you got to be willing to take that bold step, whatever that may be.
And that dovetails into my last question. You wrote a book called The Child Safeguarding Policy Guide. And really, what I love about this book is it gives great concrete policies through which churches can work and say, okay, how are we protecting our most vulnerable members? How are we protecting the most vulnerable people that have been entrusted to us? And what are some things that you would encourage a church who they're hearing about abuse, they're getting to this point where they're like, maybe this could happen here, even though it is happening. How would you encourage them to kind of start this journey other than buying your book and working through your book?
Of course, I want them all to buy the book. I co-authored the book with my dear friend Shira Berkovitz, who is an Orthodox Jew who is just as concerned about her own community as it relates to this issue. And we thought, what a better way than to come together as friends and co-laborers in this and work together to help create safer communities, both in the Christian world and in the Jewish world. I think that this sounds self-serving, but the contact grace, one of the resources that we started about 2 years ago is our safeguarding certification initiative. That is where a church contacts us. We assign that church a safeguarding specialist who will walk that church through a process that we've developed based on our experience, multidiscipline, that will help educate and equip every demographic of that church community on these issues, including assisting that church in developing policies and procedures and response protocols that meet best practice standards. Raleigh, a lot of churches don't even have child and even adult protection policies. And the ones that do oftentimes have been given those policies to them by their insurance carrier. They don't even know what's in there. And we believe that if you're really going to create a culture of protection within your church, you've got to understand, and if you're going to have policies that help to enforce that, you better develop those policies yourself with the assistance of expertise. You better know what's in those policies. You better know why what's in those policies is in them, so that those policies can become part of the very DNA of who you are as a church. But a lot of churches, if they have a policy, it's on a shelf somewhere. And they had to, tell an insurance carrier that they had a policy for them to get insurance coverage. That's not a safe church. This is not a matter of checking off boxes. It's a matter of creating and transforming your culture. And so one of the things that we can offer churches is the Safeguarding Initiative, which will help empower that church to begin that cultural transformation.
Boz, thank you. Thank you so much for just being with us tonight and kind of talking through these things, because if we don't address this, then it's just going to be business as usual. People are going to slip through the cracks and people are going to experience hurt. And we may not find out about this. We may not find out about it. I mean, I'm hearing stories of people who've been in churches where I've been involved where, 20 years ago, they were abused. And there was just no one they could turn to. And so I thank you for what you do. And thank you for just helping us understand how we can actually do something to care for our most vulnerable neighbors. So thank you for joining me, Boz.
Well, Raleigh, thank you for giving me a voice, but also thank you for what you're doing in shining a light in this and expending yourself for the most vulnerable. That's an inspiration to me and so many on my team. And so keep doing what you're doing. Appreciate it.
Oh, likewise. Thank you so much.